Hello, good evening everybody. Hi, thank you for coming. I'm Nadine Smith, Director of Communications here, and welcome to the second event in the series about women leaders, supported by EY. So normally I'd feel quite concerned about the lack of gender diversity in the room, but actually it's quite nice for us to be in the majority, so we'll make no apology for that. But clearly the message is around these events that this is exactly what you want the Institute to do, and you want to hear more about how women leaders can succeed, whether it be in politics, government, or city, or business. So we've heard your message, and we hope to do more of these events throughout the year. Before we begin, our director, Peter Riddle, wanted to send his apologies. He's actually presenting an award tonight for... Sorry. It's okay. They should be able to find you soon. He's presenting an award tonight for the Select Committee Parliamentarian of the Year. Pleased to say to you as well that one of the people shortlisted is a woman, Margaret Hodge. So we should be able to bring you some news on that later. So I blogged last week anyway about the terrible start to the year for the headlines about women leaders in politics and in the city. And already at the start of this year, many people have commented back to the Institute that it's such a shame that when the topic of women as leaders comes up, it's always because of an alleged scandal, or perhaps a politician or a CEO makes a silly remark. Or because the stats show that there's still such a long way to go. And even this week, Sheryl Sandberg and Christine Lagarde said that they were once against quotas, but actually they've changed their minds. So it just tells us all the barriers are still high and there's a long way to go. So here at the IFG, we are hoping to provide our own source of more positive advice and information about how women leaders can succeed and are doing it. And I can certainly introduce you to one woman who is. It's our chair today, Miranda Curtis. She's governor of the IFG, chairman of Waterstones and of Camfed, non-executive director of Liberty Global, Marks and Spencer's and Royal Shakespeare Company. I hope we are going to have a great evening. Do tweet. The hashtag is Women Leaders. Enjoy the evening, and over to you, Miranda.
Thanks very much, Nadine, and I'd like to add my welcome to everyone to this second event in the IFG's event on women leaders. In a moment, I'll introduce our very distinguished panel of speakers, and I'll be asking each one of them in turn to spend a few minutes discussing their own personal perspectives on leadership. We'll then take half an hour or so for a general debate on the nature of effective leadership, the different challenges of leading in the public and private sectors, and the contribution of women in senior roles to organizational success. And then finally, we'll take your questions in what I'm sure is going to be a lively discussion. In my own career, the topic of women's leadership wasn't something for which I ever had any explicit responsibility. I spent most of my working life in the media and telecom sector, overseeing international joint ventures, primarily in Europe and Japan. But I'm very struck by the fact that this is currently such a live issue, not just in government and politics in Britain, but in every sector and every walk of life. Just in my own current diary, last week I sat on a panel marking the belated launch of the UK chapter of Women in Cable and Telecoms. Next week, I'll be in Tanzania for a Camfed strategy meeting, where a key topic will be how we develop the leadership skills of our executive teams across Africa, and how we equip the young women that we're educating to acquire the confidence to become leaders of change in their own communities. And then 2 weeks after that, I'll be in Denver, where as part of Liberty Global's Fast Forward Development Program, we'll be planning how to increase the ratio of women in our senior executive pipeline. So it's a very, very common and important theme. But tonight's event is, of course, primarily focused on women's leadership in the world of British politics and government. So let's start by hearing in turn from each of our panelists. I'd like to turn first to Lynn Homer, Chief Executive of HMRC since January 2012. Having previously served as Chief Executive of the Border Agency and then Permanent Secretary at the Department of Transport. Lynn, you've led both a government department and major executive agencies. Tell us about your experience.
Thank you very much, Miranda, and it's great to see a full room and to know that we're talking about something that matters to all of you. I was slightly disappointed that we had to sort of cull the noise in the room by talking at you for a while, and I hope when we finished sharing with you that we'll get back to the lively reflection that you were clearly sharing with each other before we interrupted you. As Miranda says, I have a wholly public sector career. I started my life in local government moving into the civil service about 8 years ago. And in my time in government, I've been responsible for some non-controversial topics such as immigration, transport, and now the ever-popular payment of tax and customs and excise. So I'm used to being responsible for large, complex and not always popular organisations. I guess my personal career and my views about leadership inevitably converge into a number of beliefs that have driven me over my career. The first of those, which I'm embarrassed to say it was a very sort of young view, and I'm not sure I should encourage you to plan your careers on what you thought when you were 7. But I've kind of had an attitude to life that was in the why wouldn't I do that, as opposed to why should I do that. And I've tended to take the view that if I was offered an opportunity, even if it was somewhat different from the things I've done before, that there was probably something quite exciting in that for me. I've proven that exciting was right, whether wise was also right, was perhaps something it's easier to tell in hindsight. But coming from a family where I was the first person to go to university in the family, I chose to read law. I chose to read it in London, although I came from a relatively small town in East Anglia. Both of those decisions were something my headmaster strongly disagreed with. You all understand that made me even more determined to do so. I had only the most general notion of what I was going to do with my law degree once I'd got it, and I found myself slightly accidentally becoming a solicitor in local government, whereupon I found politicians, and I found that they were the most extraordinary, infuriating, invigorating bunch of people I'd ever worked with. And I like to say that although I got into this line of business slightly by accident, that I've stayed in it by design. Now, I've taken my why wouldn't I through my career. So in my local government days, I worked initially for a borough council, doing the legal work that borough councils do. And then just when I'd begun to get that, I moved to a county council where different services are at their responsibility and therefore different areas of the law. Having kind of worked that out and done a long stint in county government, ending up as chief executive in Suffolk, I decided that Birmingham City Council, a metropolitan council, was probably fairly like Suffolk, and so I went to be chief exec in Suffolk, in Birmingham. I love other people's ringtones; they're always better than mine.
It's not another corporate disaster.
Yeah, she'll tell you about those in a minute.
I'm sure you'll fix it.
Yeah. It was probably because of my time in Birmingham that I got the phone call that said, have you thought about being a civil servant? Would you like to come and run immigration? And so I said yes. And actually, like Helen, spent a number of years in the Home Office, which I still think is one of the most challenging government departments of all of our family of services. And then from there, most latterly on to Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs, where I've got about 70,000 people, and on behalf of all the other public services, we collect in £475 billion each year from all of you willing taxpayers to redistribute to effectively underpin public services. And during that time, my mantra of saying, why wouldn't I, has moved me from being a pure lawyer into being a generalist and a policy advisor, has moved me into being given corporate finance as a responsibility, which even in the public sector is quite a challenging and different job to being a lawyer. And then increasingly has moved me into being a leader, both for an executive agency, where notionally ministers have less interest in what you do, practically not very much less, and now, after a stint in a department led by a Secretary of State, into a non-ministerial department, where again notionally ministers have less of a say in what you do, but practically not much less. My personal belief is that it is possible to transfer a great deal of your leadership experiences from one sector to another, from one type of role to another, that in all those areas I have found if you concentrate on talent and appoint good people around you, your organisation will do much better than if you just think you are the solution to all ills. That if you concentrate on good planning, I am an anal lawyer after all, and you know what you're trying to do, by when, with what investment, and you monitor and work out whether you're getting there, that people might get fed up with your questioning, but you're more likely to get where you want to go. that if you're pretty obsessed about outcomes and focused on whether you are delivering the things you said you were going to, and if you're not, what you can do about that, but also whether you remember the people that you need alongside you to help you get there. And I think recently for me, that focus on talent has been the one I'd just like to end on. And within the civil service reform, we've been focusing really strongly on talent development, including the development of women in the civil service. We have an initiative going at the moment, which is out to tender at the moment, which is specifically looking at the blockages. And I think that is the fundamental responsibility of a leader, to be the developer of talent in your organisation so that you've got the right skills in the right places to do what you need to do. I'll stop there and hand back to Miranda.
Lynn, that's very fascinating, thank you. I'm particularly intrigued by what you say about your stubbornness in achieving your goals, and also actually something which I think often gets lost in discussions about leadership, which is actually how incredibly exciting and energizing it is to actually be in a position of authority and actually to make things happen. I'd like to turn now to Fran Unsworth. Fran has spent her entire career in BBC News and is currently Deputy Director of News and Current Affairs for the corporation. Fran, I'd be really interested to hear what your comments on what it's like to lead a major news organisation through what's been, certainly in recent years, a period of considerable turmoil and in the light of pretty stringent public scrutiny.
Yes. Well, I'll start with a story. A year ago, before the BBC got into its fairly well-documented scrapes, 2 newspaper editors decided to apply to be Director General as a job share. How hard can it be, they asked each other. Well, I think we know the answer to that one now. They didn't get the job, of course, and in fact they were, semi-fictional characters in a stage play, dramatising comments of journalists. And in fact, I would say there's no need for drama about the BBC. Real life there in the past 12 months has been gripping enough. And as you highlighted in quick succession, we've had the Savile crisis, we've had the Lord McAlpine fiasco at Newsnight, senior executives forcibly removed, the departure of a Director General, and in their place we have a whole new set of leaders. So how hard can it be? Well, it didn't get any better when the new leaders came in. They had to close down a failed IT project, writing off £100 million, facing a large furore over large payoffs to senior managers, and then dealing with accusations more recently of a bullying culture. So it's hardly surprising that some people, and it was reflected in an article this morning in the Financial Times, are asking, in fact, whether the BBC is, in fact, unmanageable, and that all the leaders in it are possibly wasting their time here because it's not a job which can be done. And certainly, I think that article that I read this morning did identify why leadership at the BBC for anybody, male or female, is never going to be easy. And it's because I think that everything that we do is conducted in the public domain. For example, there have been plenty of other large IT projects which have failed, many of which have written off much, much larger sums than the BBC, but they don't actually get much of a mention. I'm not complaining about that. If you're funded by public money, then you are, of course, accountable, but it doesn't make for an easy life. And as leaders at the BBC, we're always sort of looking in the wing mirror to see what's coming up on the inside lane. And in fact, BBC executives have now been hauled before 17 different parliamentary committees, so much so that some observers are sort of asking whether this is actually compromising our editorial independence somewhat. And then there are critics in the media who, for various ideological and commercial reasons, are happy to see us in trouble and regard the scale of our success as a threat to their own interests. So how do BBC leaders cope? And I think the answer to that is in hanging on to the values that you hold as an individual and the values that your organisation holds. And now, obviously, we have to listen and learn and be receptive, and I think women are generally pretty good at that, actually. We do not want a defensive culture to take root, but at the BBC, we survive by remembering who the most important voice is that we are answerable to, and that is, of course, our audience. We don't have shareholders, but everyone in the country has a stake in the BBC. And fortunately, despite the bumpiness of the past 12 months, our audiences still appear to highly value and trust what it is that we do, and our scores on trust are still very high. We're still the most trusted news provider in the UK. So our leadership challenge is to appeal to all our licence payers, to try to disregard some of the noises off, and actually, in order to do our job properly, we do need to ensure that the teams that we build around us can answer all those stakeholders of our audience. And you know, there I think that we do have a bit of a problem. We are not as representative of the country at large as we could do, especially as far as women and ethnic minorities are concerned at senior levels of the organisation. So given some of the bear traps I've outlined, how have I, as a woman, managed to survive more than 30 years at the BBC, or Auntie, as she is known? And whilst the BBC might have a benign female nickname, if you believe what you read in the press, the BBC is male in tooth and claw. It's an antediluvian organisation where women have been groped and propositioned for most of their careers. And I do indeed come from a generation in which young women did face that kind of behaviour. I began in local radio as a reporter and producer and worked my way up through network radio and through television to being one of BBC News' senior leaders. But despite the current crop of stories that you are reading, I have always found the BBC to be a fairly benign employer. As I built my career, the newsroom culture wasn't necessarily the Guardian women's pages of the 1970s, but nor was it exactly the Wolf of Wall Street either. Thankfully today, there is zero tolerance for sexual harassment at the BBC. And it hasn't really been a case of trying to break down glass ceilings either. I'm the Deputy Director of News. We have a female Director of Radio, a female Chief Operating Officer, and a female Director of HR, although we still haven't had a female Director General. And in my long service in the same public sector organisation, it's been a case, I think, of doing a job and trying to do it well and see what happens next. It could be argued that I've spent too long in one organisation, but it is a great organisation for offering opportunity and variety for those who choose to seek it out. And in my BBC career, I think it's important to take the long view, realising that it's not a marathon, it's a marathon rather, not a sprint. And if I can bring to bear any of my experience on tonight's discussion, I would advise to take the long view and to keep a level head. And whatever an organisation's troubles, we've had our share, try not to make a crisis out of a drama. If I can end with a bit of Rudyard Kipling, he said, if you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you, then that's pretty good advice. And then he wrote, if you can trust yourself when all men doubt you. So hold on to that thought as a female leader, and you should survive and thrive.
Inspiring words from Fran, thank you very much. A couple of topics that I'm sure we'll want to come back to. Certainly one that's of great interest to the team here at the Institute is the extent to which procurement challenges across the public sector are scrutinised in different ways. And I think it's certainly fair to say that the BBC IT spend has received a degree of scrutiny that perhaps other government departments' misspending haven't quite attracted. But also some very interesting thoughts about how women develop their leadership skills in cultures that are somewhat inimical and antediluvian. But that's something we can come back to. I'd like now to turn to Dame Helen Ghosh, currently Director General of the National Trust, having previously held the role of Permanent Secretary at the Home Office. Helen, how are you finding the experience of running a charity, and is it very different from working in the public sector?
Of course, that's a question I've been asked a lot of times over the last year. I think my answer, and I'll give a slightly a longer answer than I give often when I'm asked the question, is I'd always wanted to go and work in a large charity at some stage because, and I'll come back to this in terms of my leadership journey, I increasingly recognised over the years that the reason I joined the civil service as a young graduate 30 years ago was because I wanted to make a difference to society. It was about public service. And I suppose what I realised over the years was that it's not just government that changes society. There are all sorts of forces, individuals, pressure groups, communities, activists, private sector organisations, public sector organisations that do this. And I wanted to be part of one of these different actors in how we can make society a better place. And I also, to be honest, at the age of 50, whatever I was then, 6, when I applied for the job, thought it was a chance to reinvent myself and kind of re-energise myself before it was too late. But there were very strong, consistent threads in why I wanted to work, particularly in the National Trust. And I believe there are very consistent threads in the style of leadership, well, I'm only 14 months in, that the charitable sector demands, indeed any sector demands, and I'll just say a bit about those. So I was 30 years a civil servant. I joined from reading history at university, graduate trainee, and I would say that my career was almost entirely serendipitous. I didn't have a plan. I didn't have this, one day I will be Permanent Secretary of DEFRA and then the Home Office. I just chose things that interested me. And increasingly over the years, the things that really interested me were that kind of connection between people and places and the impact that government policy has on people in places. And of course, people and places and how people and places and people's enjoyment of them can enrich people's lives is exactly what the National Trust does now. So I won't give you a resume of my career, but I started in environment, in the old Department of the Environment. I worked on housing, I worked on various urban regeneration schemes. I had a fabulous 2 and a bit years in the Government Office for London. That still existed, and now I can say, what a pity the government offices were abolished. I worked in Department for Work and Pensions because I was really interested in how big systems and big issues around benefits have an impact on the single mum at the top of the tower block in Newham. And then I worked for a while, and it was a wonderful experience for a while in HMRC. Again, a department that has an impact on people's lives in a very direct kind of way. Then I went in full circle back to DEFRA, great passion for the environment and for the way, indeed, in a different kind of way, but both locally and nationally and internationally, what they did can improve and reverse people's lives. And then to the Home Office, where again, all those issues about security, international security, local security, the impact of immigration on communities, treating people with decency and humanity, is another department which really has a direct impact on lives. So when I came to the Trust and people said, gosh, you're dealing with very different kinds of issues, I said, no, actually I'm not. It's essentially that same package of things that have always driven me through my career. The other 2 things that people said to me when I arrived at the Trust is, it must be wonderful to work in an organisation where everybody cares passionately about what they do. And I said, I didn't use the word sunshine, look, you don't understand the civil service if that's what you think. I have worked for 30 years in a series of organisations where people believe passionately in what they do. You wouldn't join the civil service if you didn't have that strong urge for public service. And whether it was in DEFRA, whether it was in the Home Office, whether it was in HMRC, wherever I've worked, people feel passionately about what they do. And in a sense, not that government departments are analogous to charities in that sense, but that same spirit of feeling passionately is something that I found when I got to the Trust. Of course, the National Trust isn't like a lot of charities because it's big. It's got 4 million members. It's nothing like the turnover of HMRC, but you know, I've got 10,000 people who work for me, which is about the number who worked for me at DEFRA. I've got 70,000 volunteers. That is very different, but I still have to deal with these kind of big IT issues, big finance issues, some big media kinds of issues, and those things, you know, take me straight back to the experiences, and I'm so grateful for the experiences I've had in running IT projects or whatever it may be in the public sector. I suppose there are two things that make it feel different. That I am far more than I was as a permanent secretary, except on some rare and rather painful occasions, much more of, as it were, an independent operator than I was as a civil servant. People ask my opinion. I can actually express my opinion. I had the rather unnerving experience the other day of appearing on Any Questions, and I suddenly thought they might ask me my opinion on Syria or tattooing. Tattooing was the subject of the week because of David Dimbleby. And I can just say what I think. I mean, I knew that if it was a National Trust-related question, I had to say what National Trust policy was. So it was kind of, a year in, it was kind of terrifying and sort of energising in exactly the same way. Leadership, just a bit about leadership. Does the leadership challenge feel very different? To be honest, it doesn't. I mean, I believe, as I think others have indicated, that there are just universal truths about leadership. I always say that a permanent secretary I worked for years ago said, the two things great leaders need are stamina and optimism. And that's as true in an NGO as it is true in government. I believe that the fundamental building block we all need is to understand ourselves, understand our approach to leadership, understand what derails us, understand what we enjoy. Because the challenge we all have, and Fran's described it, Lynn's described it, is emotional resilience. We all work, the more senior you become, and particularly with the focus of the media and politics and the city and whoever it may be, emotional resilience and being able to deal with difficult times and have the resources to do that is just as important. The one thing I don't have to do, but I'm sure she's working up to it, is appear in front of Margaret Hodge anymore. Since I think the PAC now thinks its reach extends into the private sector, I'm just waiting for her to invite me to come and talk about the National Trust. So all those things, absolutely true. Again, just to get conversation going later, do I think there's something different about women's leadership, which I think may underlie our discussion later? Actually, I don't. I don't think, I think the challenge of having it all or not having it all can apply to a senior executive in any field, man, woman, and I haven't had it all and they haven't had it all because I've made certain choices about my career. Do I think there is a fundamental difference about successful women leaders and male leaders? No. I think, as with, and I'd say this from my previous experience, I always used to advise young civil servants that, in fact, the difference in personality between the ministers you work for is much more important than the difference in the politics and, indeed, political party of the ministers you work for. And so I think that personality, the personality of the leader and their natural inclination is far more important. It's very interesting, having arrived in the National Trust at a time, after Fiona Reynolds did wonderful things at the Trust, but she is definitely, and I'm going to get this wrong, who's a Myers-Briggs expert, well, I'm INTJ, and she's definitely everything that's the reverse of that. So sort of caring and nurturing and supportive, and I think I'm the INT. Can I have a bit of evidence? And I've learnt to show emotional intelligence and all of that stuff, but actually I'm quite, I think some people find me a bit bracing. Actually, one of the things that's very interesting, I think in a civil service context, I was always put very much as the soggy, at this sort of soft and nurturing end of any scale. In arriving in the National Trust, I'm definitely find myself strangely at the other end of the scale. I don't know what tells me. The only thing I think it may well be true about it being easier to be a woman leader is something about playing parts. I was always very impressed. Some of you will have done this training course where you go off and think about being Henry V, you know, when he's stirring people up at Honfleur, Harfleur, when he's cheering people up before the Battle of Agincourt, when he's courting Princess Catherine and all of that stuff, and how we as leaders have to play different parts. I do wonder if there's an element in there which is something to do with it being easier for us to play different parts. Don't know why that should be. I just think it's quite an interesting question. So that's me.
Great deal to think about from those comments. Thank you very much, Helen. A couple of points we might want to come back to that spring to my mind. Firstly, I think a really central issue, which is the different challenges of leading a team when in the public and private sectors, where you have different levers for remuneration and incentive. You know, in an organisation where you can't offer financial incentive, how do you actually inspire and how do you actually get a team to deliver? And also, I think a fascinating point about role playing, which certainly in the international dimension, in my experience, is highly relevant. One takes on a different persona in different parts of the world. It's a wonderful segue to Vivienne. Vivienne, like me, has spent most of her career in the corporate sector, one of our most successful and most senior British businesswomen, and now building a diverse portfolio, but equally prestigious. She chairs Valorec SA. She is also lead independent director at DFID. She's the SID at Pearson. She's on the board of Rio Tinto. I think should have some fascinating comments to share with us about that experience, that transition from a pure private sector existence to a private and public sector combined life.
Well, thank you, and good evening, everybody. Yes, so my career, 30 years at BP. There seems to be something about the number 30, doesn't there? I don't know what it is, must be our age. But 30 years at BP, and it was definitely time for a change. I had a fantastic career. My final job was as an executive vice president with one of the 3 operating divisions, so gas, power, and all the renewable energies, which is something that I was very passionate about. So 30 years inside one organisation. It wasn't called Auntie, but it felt a bit like a mother figure, this organisation that I'd spent all my life in. It was a wonderful organisation, and it gave me extraordinary personal development opportunities, which I observe exist equally in the civil service. It's one of the things I've been very impressed by, actually, the extent to which you develop staff in the civil service. And aged, what was I then? I don't know, however old I was, just about 50. My children at the time were 4 and 7. I had nowhere else to go inside BP. I'd sort of got to probably the most senior job they were going to give me. And so it was definitely time for a shift. And I was already on the board of Rio Tinto, but decided that actually I wanted to build a portfolio that would allow me to continue to develop new skills, have new experiences, but actually continue to grow. I was much too young to stop and certainly didn't wish to stay at home with my children, although I did rather fancy spending a bit more time with them than I had done. And so I took a series of non-executive roles, and my thinking as I built this portfolio was that there had to be something that connected each job with the previous job, so everything needed to be connected to everything else in order that my experience could be transferred from one role to the other. And that worked quite well to begin with. So I had Rio Tinto, which of course is an extractive industry, links to BP. I then was offered a job as on the board of BG, so oil and gas. So yes, this is all connected. And then my plan went unstuck because then some really interesting things came along. So the first of them was DFID. Would I be interested in being the lead independent director at DFID? I had very little experience of UK government, no experience of politics, and this was, for me, a really fascinating challenge and one which I have thoroughly, thoroughly enjoyed. Partly because of the work of the department, which I find really interesting, but also just to see a different environment, to see civil servants in action, to see civil servants with ministers, to see the impact that politics has on the activities that they carry out, but also to see how much is very similar. So all the disciplines that you need to be a good business person, I believe you need to be effective in the civil service. The need for proper planning, budgeting, monitoring, measurement, valuing performance, all of these things are the same, whether you're in the civil service or whether you're in the private sector. What makes, I think, the private sector easier is profit. Because profit is an absolute thing that you can measure, that you can put your hands around and you know what it is. And you compare yourself, with your competitors. You can compare yourself this year with last year. And it's it helps. It gives you a yardstick against which you can assess your own and your company's performance. And I think inside the civil service, you don't have such an easy, obvious yardstick against which to measure yourself. I have huge respect for people who deal with ministers. And I've seen now 2 Secretaries of State come into DFID, and I've seen how they have different personalities, they have different priorities, and I've seen how the department has seamlessly moved to serving one, to serving the other, with huge grace and dexterity, and yet the underlying business carries on, being delivered day in, day out around the world. In terms of leadership, I do agree with you that it's more about personality than anything else. For me, my leadership experience was all about becoming the most authentic and real I could become. And that's what I spent a lot of time working on. Who am I? What do I really want? And I had to start, going back to being 7 years old, I had to start by letting go of all the things that other people wanted me to be. You know, my parents, they'd had a huge influence on what they thought I should be. And I'd sort of taken on some of that, and I had to let that go. You know, my bosses, I had to work out what I was as a leader and what was my authentic style and my own way of leading. And the way in which I led changed significantly over my career. And I think to begin with, I'd taken on a model of leadership that was actually much more about standing there and telling people where to go. And actually, it wasn't really me. It was the leadership model I observed very frequently around me, but it wasn't me. My leadership style was actually about creating the opportunities for other people to come up with the answers and to give them a sense of real ownership of those problems and issues, and coming up with solutions to those problems. Doing that at the same time as, you know, delivering performance as delivering against expectations. So that for me was my journey. It was about finding what it was I truly did and what I truly could do well. Moving from being executive to non-executive is a big shift, because when you're an executive, you're in control, you're in charge, however you choose to do that, and you're there day to day, and I loved that hands-on experience. You go to being non-executive, and you interact infrequently, and one of the biggest issues to deal with, I think, is what I would call the information gap between the executive, who have all the numbers, all the answers, all the data, and are there all the time, to being non-executive, where actually they feed you what they want you to know. And so you've got to find strategies that actually allow you to fill in that picture, and that's something that I've been working quite hard to get better at and to do well. I hadn't really realised when I left BP and took on non-exec roles that actually I was starting a second career. And it has been very energising to actually build a second career and to think about it as strategically as I thought about my first career. And that's certainly something that I intend to carry on doing.
An enormous amount to take away from Vivienne's comments, and I'm particularly struck by what both she and Helen were saying about the fact that taking on a new challenge in the later stages of your career is the most fantastic opportunity to reinvent and re-energize yourself. And I think that it may be the mark of a really good leader that you are open to new experiences, new influences, to learning about new sectors, and to acquiring broader perspectives on the world. And those may be issues that we want to come back to. And finally, last but not least, I'd like to turn to Liz Bingham from Ernst & Young. Ernst & Young, who are very generously sponsoring this series of events on women's leadership. Liz is a managing partner at Ernst & Young, where she's also ambassador for diversity and inclusiveness. And I think we'd be really interested to hear your perspectives on the issues of women's leadership.
Thanks, Miranda. Delighted to be here. Before I sort of kick off on my very short introduction, I just want to have a quick show of hands, if I may. Has anybody in the room ever heard of, read about, or experienced imposter syndrome? There's quite a few hands going. Oh, you can imagine how I feel up here, having listened to these amazing ladies and their experiences. And I was sitting here thinking, oh my God, what am I doing here? And then I thought, oh, well, of course I'm here because we're sponsoring. Naturally. And then I thought, no, actually, no, I do have a story to tell, and so it probably is appropriate for me to be here. But I wanted to just put that into the room because I want you to hold on to that as we talk through the rest of this evening. It is a trait that is particularly prevalent amongst women, and almost to the point where it doesn't matter how senior you get, there's still an element of inside of you feeling that imposter syndrome starting to talk to you. But so much of what my co-panelists have said have really resonated with me. I've done 28 years at EY, so not quite the 30. So still a few miles left in me, hopefully. I'm from a working class background. I was educated through the English state school system. I'm not a graduate. Self-evidently, I'm a female, so not an obvious candidate for professional services. I'm also lesbian, as if the rest of it wasn't hard enough, just, oh God, But I was raised, I think similarly to you, Lynn, with this notion of if you aim for the moon, you might hit the top of a tree. That's what my mother used to say to my brother and I. So it didn't occur to me that any of this stuff might be difficult. And Fran, I think you said, well, how hard can it be? Being Director General of the BBC. And that was kind of my approach when I entered the workplace. Well, how hard can this stuff be? I mean, it's just fairly obvious. You turn up at the right time and you do what you're told and you go home again. So when I was younger, it never occurred to me that there might be obstacles in my way. The fact that I was gay, the fact I was a woman, the fact I was not a graduate, all of that was irrelevant as far as I was concerned. And I think because of that, I was able to be quite authentic from the get-go, because I didn't know to be anything other than that, because I thought that was going to be enough. And I guess on reflection, what I hadn't realized at the time was that actually leadership starts really early on, really early on. You might not characterize it as leadership, and I certainly didn't characterize it as leadership at the time. But, I would say that anybody who needs a big title or a big corner office or a personal car parking space or whatever it is and thinks that makes them a leader, that's just rubbish. From a very early age, we are all leading. Probably even at school we lead in different ways, but certainly in the workplace we start to lead very early on. We lead ourselves, we get out of bed in the morning, that's often quite a challenge. We lead teams, we work with people. It's very rare that we're only operating in isolation. Those of us who are client serving, whether it's internal or external clients, have a community and a constituency to serve. So we're leading in terms of serving those clients and stakeholders. So it happens right the way through your career. But of course, the more senior you become, the more it becomes self-evident, and you have to go on leadership development programs. So we're going to develop you now as a leader. And nobody ever says to you, actually, you've been leading for quite a long time. All we need to do is take those skills and hone those skills and take the very best of what you're delivering and make you even better. And in fact, most organizations, certainly in the private sector, in my experience, actually take all of the things you're really bad at and say, right, well, let's ignore the things you're really good at, and let's focus on the things you're really bad at, and let's try and make you better at the things you're really bad at. which of course helps to reinforce the imposter syndrome, because you then sit there thinking, but I'm terrible at all these things. I'm never going to be good at all these things, so what on earth am I doing here? We need to focus on our strengths and think about ourselves in the context of leadership. And in doing that, think about the space that we fill in the world around us and how people are reacting and interacting with us in our day-to-day world. It's not a huge thing. It is something that we all do every day. But inevitably, in organisations, whether it's public sector or private sector, there is a hierarchy. And you know, I don't know whether this is different in other countries. I mean, certainly in my experience in the US, in our business, there tends to be less of a hierarchy. In the UK, we do have a hierarchy. There's a hierarchy built through our social construct and our class system, quite apart from anything else. But we have a hierarchy in business, either public or private sector. And the reality is that the closer you get to the top of that hierarchy, so the bigger your leadership role, the lonelier it gets. And that's not just for women, that's for men as well. And the issue that I think that has created for us is everybody knows it's lonely up there. It feels lonely. You don't know who your pals are. You don't know who to reach out to. Where's your gang? You've been promoted, so you've left one gang behind and you haven't quite integrated into the next gang, and the next gang's smaller than the previous gang, and they're all really horrible. This is speaking very personally. They're all really horrible. Because they're in a very small gang and they're feeling really lonely and they've got this new kid on the block, and why on earth do they want to spend any time integrating this new kid when actually all they're worried about is staying on top of this hierarchy and this pyramid themselves. And so one of the things that I would commend to all of us is to recognize that loneliness and to find ways, and Helen talked about resilience, to find ways to build resilience in a different way, because you're unlikely to get it from those that are immediately around you. So you find ways to build it in a different way. And that might be from your partner, from your friends, from your old workmates, from even professional help, or especially professional help. Find a way to enable you to deal with the loneliness of being in that very senior leadership position. You don't need to look like everybody else that's around you, and the authenticity point is so important, to find your own way and your own style of leadership. But if you stick hard and fast to that, then it becomes an even lonelier place, because because there are so few people in that arena, most people want to look like everybody else because nobody wants to stand out. So it's tough, it's lonely, it's very exhilarating. It really is. And I think wherever you are in your leadership journey, to really enjoy that journey and to take some time to reflect on the difference that you're making. And Vivienne, I think you talked about profit. And I think of profit in the private sector, as we would think about it, is a proxy for growth. So the profit that EY makes enables us to grow, and that growth enables us to hire more people. It enables us to spend more money on developing people, which means that each of those individuals has a different and better experience working for the firm. It enables us, therefore, to attract better people, which means that the impact that we have on the clients that we work with is better. And I think all of that, you can use that proxy of profit for growth wherever you are, whether you're in public sector or private sector. What government would not want their country to grow? I mean, all we've heard about over the last week is the GDP of 2% in the UK. It's all about growth. 8 years ago, I warrant that the majority of the population wouldn't even know what GDP stood for, but now we've been obsessed by it. And it's right that we should be obsessed by it, because growth provides opportunity for every individual, for every business, for every community. So it requires good leadership to drive and strive and sustain that growth. It requires diversity at the top. This is not about men bad, women good, but it is about difference and celebrating those differences and getting the best of all that we can bring to bear into public and private sector.
Great. Thank you very much, Liz, for finishing our introductory section. I'm conscious of time, and I know people are going to have a lot of questions, so I'm going to just raise two topics for discussion by the panel before we open it up to the floor. The first question is about the culture and tone of British politics. One thinks of the bear pit atmosphere in Parliament, the media scrutiny of government. How hard is it to maintain and develop your leadership skills in that environment? And I might start with Lynn.
I think it's a great developmental bear pit to be in, because you do have to hone your skills. I don't myself think leadership in a political environment is significantly harder than any other. I think what you've got to be as a leader is capable of managing complex relationships, your staff, your shareholders or your politicians or your council, but also your end users, whether you regard them as customers or citizens. And for me, it is about ensuring that you, as a respondent in those discussions, that you know what you're doing, why you're doing it, you are confident about your reason for being there, but you're also confident about the circumstance you're in. And we do get a lot of scrutiny. I don't myself personally think BBC's IT projects are that much more scrutinised than any other part of the public sector, if I'm honest. I can think of a number that I've been involved with. But it's blooming right that we are scrutinised, because we spend a lot of money on behalf of a lot of people, and if we don't get that accountability, in a sense, don't be in the space. So that perhaps doesn't sound very, that doesn't sound very comforting in a way, but I think it's a choice you make if you're going to be in complex leadership, to hold those things, in a safe space. And at the end of the day, I do say to my staff and colleagues quite often, we have to remember the second part of our name. We are servants. If you don't like that bit of the name, you're probably in the wrong career. And if you are a public servant, then being held accountable is a key part of the task.
Yeah. I would actually like to pick up or challenge something that Liz said, which is that one of the things, and of course, I'm busy making new friends and new networks in my new world, but I didn't feel lonely at the top. I mean, in one sense, we're lonely at the top. You're sitting in front of Margaret Hodge, or you see your name appear in the paper, but actually, I think the civil service gives a pretty good support network. I knew that if I had a problem, I had lots of people who understood exactly what my problem was. As a permanent secretary, I could talk to Lynn, I could talk to Nick McPherson. When the cabinet secretary I worked for most of my time was Gus. There were lots of other people who I could turn to and were genuinely supportive, because we were kind of all in it together. And I think that is a bit different, possibly, from exactly. No, and of course. I won't name particular departments or parts of government where I felt it was more like a jungle than others. Some parts of government do feel more like a jungle than others. But on the whole, I felt very well supported. I'd been there for 30 years. I had a lot of great networks. I entirely support what Lynn said about, there's a bit of, if you don't like the heat, stay out of the kitchen. The wonderful thing about working in government for me was that when it flew, when you were working for a minister who had a clear vision, or a government that had a clear vision of what was needed to be done, you could help them, it was going well, you were changing things in a good kind of way. There's nothing to beat it. And the payoff for that, the trade-off for that, is that kind of public scrutiny. The only time it really ground me down, I have to say, is when I felt I was working for ministers who were taking decisions for the wrong reason, who were taking decisions because of what the Daily Mail would say. The big politicians you work for don't do that, and that is when you really get this sense of invigoration. I think the negativity, when you feel it drives tribal decision-making or suboptimal decision-making or just doing the wrong thing, that's when you do have to swallow quite hard, I think.
Fran, anything you want to add to that?
Well, just to go back to the question that you asked, which was about the bear pit nature of the political world, and actually it just got me thinking about, of course that doesn't just apply to the political world, there's possibly a bear pit nature to quite a lot of environments that we work in, and I do think there is an issue about how people will be punished if they do not express themselves always in quite a conformist sort of way, actually. So I see it around, you know, the environment I work in, that if you sort of start thinking aloud and are not entirely crisp in your judgments, or you say something a bit stupid, then you run the risk of possibly being written off. And that's kind of the nature of a fast news environment where there is a premium placed on your ability to express yourself clearly, concisely, and in ways that people can understand. And I sometimes wonder whether that actually rules an awful lot of people out, because I know some very good people who think aloud and say some stupid things from time to time. They're actually very clever, very creative people quite often. So I do think that it's not just about politics, I do think that we have to think about the sort of the national discourse in general and be a bit more flexible about what it is that we think makes a leader, particularly around those sort of areas.
That's very interesting. I'd like to change the subject a little and ask Vivienne, given that your experience in transitioning from in working in both the public and private sectors, about the qualities of leadership in respect of building and incenting your team, and what's your experience coming from the private sector, where you can primarily use financial remuneration as a reward to incent and encourage people to deliver performance, and now looking at operating in private sector. What's your sense of what are the appropriate elements that a leader needs to be taking into account when actually building a team and delivering performance?
It's interesting, I was having a conversation, I think, last week with someone, and they were saying, well, we've got to talk about the incentive programs that we're going to put in place. This was in the company that I chair in France. And I said, I've never come across a compensation package that actually incentivizes. I mean, the amount of strife they cause, the amount of dissent and difficulty because somebody's got more than somebody else, or this isn't fair, or that isn't fair, or they're compensation schemes at the end of the day, and people want to feel fairly compensated. I, for a long, long time, was responsible for all of BP's trading businesses. And traders are pretty, red meat, aggressive, macho, and money matters to them. It really, really matters to them. But what I found, even in that environment, was that it was much more important the organisation they worked for and the values of that organisation than the amount of money they got paid. So provided there was equity, however they defined it, but provided there was equity in the amount of money, then what was really important were the values of the organisation and feeling that you would feel proud to be working for that organisation and to talk to others about what you were doing. And I think, to me, you can never spend too much time as a leader thinking about the implicit and explicit values of your organisation and how you align people to those values, because that's worth more than anything.
I'd certainly like to echo that from my own personal experience. I spent many years of my career overseeing a large joint venture in Japan, working in partnership with a Japanese trading house. And the challenge we had there was, how could we actually incent a workforce where we couldn't offer money as a remuneration because it was culturally inappropriate. We couldn't promote on merit because promotion was entirely age-related, and we couldn't fire people. And the only way that we could actually build a management team and incent the performance we were looking for was very slowly and very carefully over a long period of time to build respect and mutual trust. and we had to establish the values, and it was the only way that we could actually function. So I think what you're saying is absolutely appropriate. Would anyone else like to comment on that?
Yeah, just to reinforce that, I mean, there's some research done recently which we've been looking at, which is a survey of 100 FTSE 100 and SAP 100 organisations, and 86% of those surveyed said that the biggest engagement lever in their organisation was the quality of their manager. Only 11% said it was pay and rations.
We've been doing some work. HMRC has traditionally had the lowest engagement scores in government. We've been surveying for a number of years, and so far we've purposefully held everybody else up. That's going to be a long journey, and we've been doing some work on trust in the organisation. And one of the women from Bath University who we work with, Veronica Hope-Haley, was sharing with us a Dutch proverb, which is that trust walks in very slowly and leaves on a horse. And that is very true. And some of the ground HMRC lost in the merger and in the loss of the child benefit discs and in some of the controversy that surrounded it has ebbed away at people's confidence. And so replacing that with sort of reminding them the value base they're attached to and why what they do is important is a really important role, but you can't do it. I don't think just because we haven't got money, I don't think you can do it fast, even if you've got compensation schemes that are more flexible than ours, because it has to be built very carefully.
No, just entirely to echo what everybody has said.
Okay.
People like being part of a successful organisation, and I think that's why as leaders I felt one of my key roles was to make people feel proud of the organisation. I mean, even if they might be getting batterings in the media or from their own ministers sometimes or from other ministers, that sense that I had faith that what they had was significant was the most important thing, far more important, particularly when you didn't have any money to offer them, than offering them any kind of financial incentive.
And on that uplifting note, I think we might open the debate to questions from the floor. Couple of ground rules. If you want to ask a question, please identify yourself, and please try and restrict yourself to one clear question so that as many people as possible get a chance to air their views. And we'll also take questions from the overflow room, but we'll ask the team to help us organise that. We'll start with the young lady at the back there.
Hi, my name's Rosalind Gator. I work for DFID. Thank you very much, everyone, for some really stimulating conversations. I just wanted to pick up on this idea of role-playing. And I agree that I think that women are typically quite good at role-playing, and I take that point. But at the same time, I think that there are a lot of roles for women that they can't play, or indeed that they are barred from playing. And I'd be really interested to hear your experiences of when you've come up against conversations or meetings, or usually, in my experience, things in the margins that you haven't been able to enter, and what you did in those situations in order to try and enter them.
Anyone like to take that?
Well, that's where to start. I think there are. I'm not quite sure about the role playing. I mean, I have this awful image of going on development training courses and being forced into role play situations. So I'm not a huge fan of that. But just to address the question around, have you found yourself in situations that you can't influence, and how do you try and go around that? Yeah, often, and sometimes they're insurmountable. And sometimes you don't kind of see them coming at you. So my experience to start off with would have been before I was made a partner at the firm, and I was leading a big part of the business, but not a partner. And actually most of the time, 99% of the time, that was absolutely fine, until there was a critical tipping point where we had to make a decision about how we were going to structure the business. And my boss asked me to write him a paper so he could take it to the partners meeting, because I didn't have a seat at the table because I wasn't a partner. And I tried to persuade him, to influence him. I got quite emotional about it in the end, none of which helped at all. I'm still not invited to the party. So it was really, really difficult, and subsequently I found in similar situations I found it really difficult to, when somebody's determined to put a glass ceiling in front of you and rely on structure or some other protocol to keep you distant, it's really difficult to deal with that, other than to play the long game. And to regroup. And so I regrouped and thought, well, actually, if I really want to influence this business, then I now know what I need to do, and I need to be a partner in this business in order to have a seat at that table, because that's the only way that I was going to be able to do that. So you kind of have to pick your battles, I think.
Yes, my answer is a great segue from what Liz had to say. In a sense, I didn't mean we should flit around playing different roles and pretending different things. It's just that the role of the leader calls on you sometimes to think, God, these people really need cheering up. This is my cheering up mode. These people really need bracing and told to pull themselves together. I'm in pull myself together mode. But I think it's really this point about playing the long game. What I learned, and I'll just tell a tiny story about this, was that it's not inauthentic to choose behaviour which achieves your objective. The example I give, when I rocked up at HMRC, when it merged, I was in Inland Revenue and it merged with Customs and Excise, there was a wholly male board, some people who'd come, not people who were not civil servants, people who'd come from a variety of backgrounds, which was great and very bracing, but some of the, and I think for a while I was the only woman on the board, and I was the DG for corporate services, oddly enough. There was once a very butch macho guy who came and said, right, I need to get these people in my team and we can ignore all the civil service rules and we'll do this, that and the other and I'll get in my mate so-and-so. And I found this deeply offensive as the person who was the keeper of the flame on how we should do things properly. And in this board meeting, I got very emotional. I said, don't be ridiculous, Steve, you can't possibly do this, and kind of went off on one. And the very wise chairman, then Chairman David Varney, took me on one side afterwards and he said, Helen, that was me being kind of authentic and emotional and all those sort of kinds of things and talking too much. And he said, now Helen, that's sort of, you got that off your chest, but did it actually achieve your objective? Did it in fact achieve what you wanted to achieve? And he put me in touch, it was the first time in my whole career I'd ever had a coach, put me in touch with, again, a very wise woman who said, first of all, explore what does make you go off on one and how you can control those moments and so on, but also think about handling, what is effective behaviour in a given situation. So actually you can be, if you're someone who always talks or always catches the chairman's eye, go to a meeting and say absolutely nothing, or say one or two very, very pithy things. You're going somewhere, bidding for money, decide that rather than make it an emotional appeal, you're trying to appeal to people with very hard heads, be very hard-headed yourself. So that thing about, okay, so what am I trying to achieve in the long term? Will making a fuss about the fact that they haven't invited me out for a drink or whatever the thing from which you feel excluded may be, actually think, as it were, in a more Machiavellian way about what is the thing you're trying to achieve and how you can achieve it and modify your behaviour to that end. I don't think it's inauthentic, it's just how you can achieve objectives.
And I think Helen illustrates wonderfully the concept that one can use role play as a form of armour. And once you've got your armour on, that's fantastically liberating because you can play all sorts of games in your own way. Next question. This lady here.
Hi, my name's Radhika. I'm a writer for the Telegraph's Women's section. My question is mainly to Helen. With your experience of working in the government, why do you think that it's not just a problem now to get women into Parliament, but that so many women are leaving? About 4 Conservative and female MPs have left it lately. Do you think it's part of the sort of boyish?
I honestly don't know. I mean, I've read probably you wrote them, and I've read the same articles, and I've read other political commentators saying, could you all pull yourselves together, girls? It's always been like this kind of stuff. I do think, and this is actually something, this isn't a session about, work-life balance and how you bring up children and all of those sorts of things, but I do think that one of the keys to happiness, if it is happiness, or at least sanity, is being very, and I had 2 children now grown up, worked part-time for quite a long time, is knowing at any stage in your life what it is you really want. And the people I've seen, the women in particular, but sometimes men, who I've mentored or who've come to talk to me about my career and how I've handled those things, very often they are actually conflicted. And I've often said to them, sorry, I don't think you really know what you want. I think you don't know whether you really want, at this stage, to be at home with your little ones, or whether you want that high-profile job where you're meeting the Prime Minister every day and going off to Parliament, da-da-da-da-da. Look into yourself and decide what you want at that stage in your career. And then find a lower-profile job now, and then you can have a higher-profile job later on. Somebody said, life is long. Your career actually is one where you don't have to have it all now and grab it now. And I think actually since my youth, I mean, Parliament has become much, much more family friendly in terms of the hours that they sit and no more votes, not many votes at 2 o'clock in the morning and so on. Possibly it's that those people hadn't quite thought whether that really was the thing they wanted at that stage in their lives. And, you know, who knows, I can't look into their minds. Perhaps they hadn't done due diligence, but I suspect it's something to do with, they thought, actually, I don't want this as much as I want to be with my family, to spend more time doing whatever it is I want to do. And I do think that's a very, very important thing.
Next question. Could you wait for the microphone? Sorry. Thanks.
Thank you. Linda Davidson.
From where?
Oh, I'm a digital innovation. I'm really struck by all of your unifying experience in a singular organisation, the longevity of that. I'm just wondering whether or not you think it's had an effect on your leadership journey.
That's a very interesting question.
I don't see mine as quite as unifying as 30 years in the BBC, and you can kind of see it as unifying in the sense it's public sector, but I think the organisations I've worked for are really different from each other, and I suspect bits of BP were very different from each other, and so I think probably what you've heard each of us draw out is something about what we want from life that means we do things that have threads running through them. But I personally think my own journey has been made richer and more fun by having quite a lot of variety and change. Some of it, change I forced on myself, and some of it, in a sense, happenstance that others have forced on me or circumstance has. But for me, it is about the adaptability you can bring to those circumstances. And I mean, Helen's point about, you know, for women who have a family, for men who have a family, you will go through massive change in your circumstances from, you know, having none, having young, having old, hoping they'll go, and eventually them going. And, you know, what I've personally felt really strongly is that being resilient enough to make those changes and to feel confident about them, whether they're in a place or whether they are, you know, in a single place or a new place. I did work a long time at one council. It was a very old-fashioned county council. I had a chairman walk behind me when I returned from my 3rd maternity break, and he laughed and said, "Oh, she's back again. She's had another one. I suppose we'll give her another promotion like we normally do." He went on, now I could have got very cross about this because he went on to say, she could have had them as triplets and saved us all a lot of bother. However, at that place, they valued me, and each time I went away, when I came back, they assumed they were going to do something with me. That's what the continuity gave me. The disadvantage of working in that place is they thought they knew me, and the things they asked me to do tended to be the things they always asked me to do. When I went to a new council, I had no reputation from day one, and it takes you right back to explaining, earning, reinventing yourself if that's what you choose to do. So, you know, for me, whether you stay or go, you can create adaptability if you want to.
Well, I mean, I stayed 30 years at the BBC because I absolutely love news. You know, I love the buzz of a newsroom. You know, I love having that daily adrenaline surge of, actually I have less of it now than I have done as other points in my career, because you get away from that coalface. And then, of course, if you want to be a broadcast news journalist, then there aren't that many places to do it, actually, in the UK. And the BBC is full of sort of opportunity. So, and I always say to people, there's a saying in the BBC of correspondence, that you're only as a correspondent as good as your editor thinks you are. And unfortunately, there's some truth in that, but I always say to those correspondents, well, don't worry, because editors change, don't they? And that's the sort of the thing about working in kind of that organisation, that you have the opportunity to go and do something else. The world around you changes. You know, I've had a great career. I've been abroad. I've gone to done lots of big stories. So the opportunities of sort of staying in one place actually provided me with what I wanted to do. But that might not always be the case. And I just think, as far as, you know, I'm not one of those people who ever managed a career, truthfully. I just sort of took the next opportunity that came along. I never said, you know, when I started, oh, that's where I want to be. I just said, oh, that looks quite an interesting job. I think I'll apply for that one. And I think it sort of possibly leads to more job satisfaction or more personal satisfaction if you can manage your career like that, truthfully, because then you will enjoy what you're doing rather than feeling that you failed in some way because you didn't become the Director General.
Next question.
Hi, I'm Deborah Brooks in the Cabinet Office, and I'm working on the piece of work that Lynn mentioned right at the beginning about how to remove barriers to women succeeding. So I wanted to ask really to what extent people think organisations can address the progression of women when in fact what quite a lot of you spoke about was something innate about imposter syndrome, or conversely a self-belief that actually started from your childhood and maybe from your parents. So really that tension between, you know, what's inside you and actually what organisations can do.
Vivienne.
Of course, you know, not all women get to the top and not all men get to the top. So I think, you know, there are some capabilities that mean that some people are perhaps more likely to get there, male or female, than others. I think organisations can create the conditions for women and men, for everyone to be successful, and I think that's what's required. I think then, though, it does come down to a lot of personal choice. And I think being, as you said, I think being absolutely clear about what you want for yourself and what your priorities are at any point in time is terribly important. My own experience, I mean, you know, 30 years at BP, I never ever felt that there was anything in the environment that was stopping me. So it was my choice that determined where I went and what I did. Rather, I must say, rather on the same basis, you know, I had no 10-year plan, and indeed I remember lying when somebody said to me, you know, well, where do you want to be in 5 years' time? And it was clearly, you're expected to have an answer, so I made one up. But I literally, exactly the same as you know, I just took opportunities that really looked challenging, that looked as if they would give me a chance to grow.
Liz?
I think it's really important for organisations to recognise that people, whether it's men or women or whatever, everybody's different. People develop at a different rate and require different experiences in order to be able to develop. Now, if you start from the premise of, you know, we're a meritocracy, everybody here has the opportunity to succeed as long as you look like this, then you've got a problem. But you know, what I would say in UK PLC is that we haven't focused necessarily on that individuality when we've looked at development of individuals through the organisation, and particularly for women at moments in time where, you know, they may be having families and so, you know, may have pressed the pause button on their career. And we, you know, and certainly from an EY perspective, 5 years ago, we would just go, oh, you know, Lynn's back from maternity leave, oh, yeah, whatever. Yeah. Without recognising that actually she needed some help to onboard back into the business. And, you know, just even doing small things like that say, like, welcome back, and you know, what are your personal limitations, what are your desires in terms of hours and travel and so on, you know, having those really open conversations just to make each individual feel like an individual and feel that they've still got a really valuable role to play in the business is really important. But it's tough, and we haven't focused on it for a long time. And that's why we have a thin pipeline when it comes to getting women through to senior leadership positions.
Lynn.
One thing I think organisations can do is to do some work on the recruitment process, including interviews, just to make sure that neither the applicant nor the interviewer is building up any biases without realising it. And we're doing some fascinating training around unconscious bias, which I believe just frees people up to think a little bit more about what might interfere with good judgment. And I don't believe, again, that that's just about gender. If I'm honest, I have a cross-government responsibility around disability, and I think issues are very similar. But we've found within HMRC that if we can get people to do just a little bit of self-training on unconscious bias, that their ability to exploit the diverse talent they've got, their ability to be brave enough or confident enough to put themselves in a different environment can be enhanced. So if you've not experienced that, I would thoroughly recommend it. It doesn't solve all ills, but it opens some parts of the inquisitive brain to just being a little bit more thoughtful.
And there's some Harvard Business School stuff on the internet that you can just do a self-test on unconscious bias, which delivers fascinating results. I did one on LGBT. So is my natural preference to prefer gay people to straight people, and I took it 3 times because I thought, well, that's clearly wrong. I'm not going to tell you what the answer was, but it's clearly wrong. But actually it came out the same answer every time. But there's an interesting whole range of tests that you can take. Harvard Business School.
I don't know if the stats are the same as they were before, but when I was working alongside Lynn and again looking at this whole fascinating issue about talent and how to encourage particular kind of genders of talent, it was getting people to apply that was the thing, getting them to feel that they were as qualified. I was always a bit of a, could you all pull yourselves together? Why wouldn't people think they were qualified? But the stats showed that women, highly qualified women, were less likely to apply. That's something about imposter syndrome. I also think there's a sort of duty on us. I'm going to talk myself back as though I were a civil servant again. There was a duty on us. There is a duty on us as women leaders to show that it's enjoyable. I mean, I do think there's an issue where if we go around thinking, oh God, this is such a struggle, and actually it will put people off. They'll think, do I want her life? Do I want that constant tearing between my home and my work, or whatever it may be? So I think there is a real duty on us to be honest about what the challenges are and how you can prepare for them, but show the real reward you get for being a leader. And I think sometimes that's something that we don't do enough.
If I might just add a comment there, I think what's most encouraging, for example, in my experience, where I have a very broad portfolio now of corporate and not-for-profit entities, there isn't a single organisation I'm involved in where this issue is not front and foremost at the moment. And it's not an issue that is only being discussed by the women in the organisation. It's being discussed at chairman level, at the boards, and not just in the context of women, but about increasing the diversity of perspective and actually making sure that you're drawing on the richness of the talent that's available to you. One last question, I think, over here.
Hi, I'm Susanna from Civil Service World. Building on Vivienne's point, which I think was that there's so much an organisation can do, and after that, it's a personal journey that people have to take. But actually, our choices, our personal journey are influenced by the societies we live in and grow up in. So I just wonder what the panel thinks. Should we be talking here about what organisations can do, or should we be talking about and trying to change the societal expectations and norms in which we operate? I'd be particularly interested to hear experience from people who have worked in different cultures, in the way that different cultures impact on women as leaders.
It's interesting. I was on a call earlier today with some colleagues from all over EMEA, and in our Russia business and in our Southern European, so Turkey, Bulgaria sort of business, we have over 30% female partners. Now globally we're 15%, in the UK we're 18%, and they're over 30%. And countries, communities that that are sort of back in the day were sort of communist regimes where everybody worked, where everybody shared the responsibility for family, for children, etc. There's not even the debate. You know, it is, you know, if you have children, if you have ailing parents, between you as a partnership outside of the workplace, you figure out how you're going to sort it out, and it doesn't all fall to the women. So there is a big societal kind of construct, I think, that you know, we're certainly in the UK, where it's kind of expected that women will do the nurturing and caring and so on. I think that's changing slowly, she says, not being a mother. But, you know, I look at my 11-year-old goddaughter, and, you know, her mother works full-time. All of her friends' mothers work full-time. One of them is Fiona Bruce, actually. So, you know, so they've got really great role models of working mums. So hopefully that generation, you know, they will quite naturally have a conversation with their partners to say, actually, we need to share the responsibility here. But, you know, I don't think it's something that you can legislate for necessarily. There's you know, an element that you can do, and we've got, is it next year, we've got the shared parental leave thing coming in. But policies and procedures will only go so far. It's because this is really a hearts and minds issue, and it's slow.
Vivienne, any thoughts about different cultures?
I'd certainly very much reinforce you know, different countries. So I work a lot in France. It's 22 miles away. It's completely different. And there isn't a week when I go there when I'm not completely stunned by something that happens, because it feels so unusual to me. And certainly the relationship between women and the workplace is different in France than it is here, in subtle and not so subtle ways. I mean, I don't know how to answer your question, because it's sort of chicken and egg, and I think all of these things have to change, and it takes time. But I do think big employing organisations have a significant role to play. You know, they are significant influences on what happens and how it happens. So I think, you know, this will need to iterate and iterate. My daughter is 15, and it's interesting talking to her and her friends. They're probably split down the middle. Half of them want a rich husband, and the other half want a career.
Or both.
I don't want to have it all. Exactly.
That'd be good. Married to an academic.
And on that cheerful note, I think we're going to bring this evening's proceedings to a close. On behalf of the Institute for Government, I'd like to thank all of you for coming, and I would like you please to express your appreciation to our distinguished group of panellists.